Amen. Happy Sabbath again.
Happy Sabbath.
The message I want to share is dealing with the midnight cry. As we have been studying over the course of the week, we've been looking at the parameters of the methodology that has accompanied the midnight cry message. And when we speak of these parameters, we've been parable teaching specifically. We've been looking at comparing and contrasting and what that looks like in God's Word. We've been going through exercises which illustrate the operationalization of that parameter, what it looks like as we actually deal with a passage, deal with a history, and see how comparing and contrasting generates information that is not explicitly stated within the passage that we're seeking to understand. Now, I want us to compare and contrast the midnight cry message as given in Millerite history with our midnight cry message. And, you know, this is not going to be a comprehensive consideration of the two, right? By virtue of, it's not going to be a comprehensive study of all the things that can be understood by comparing and contrasting the Millerite midnight cry with our midnight cry. But I want to make specific points that I want us to come away with. Now, when we look at the midnight cry in Millerite history, we understand it's a history that spans a number of waymarks. And I'm going to read a quote by Joseph Bates. Now, this quote, it's in BP2, page 72, and it's the first 3 paragraphs. This is pamphlet number 2 by Joseph Bates, page 72. The first 3 paragraphs, right? And it's the reference in the Pioneer Library is BP2. Now, I'll read this passage in your hearing. It's just a narration of the development of the midnight cry. And it says, "At midnight a cry was raised, 'The bridegroom is coming, go ye out to meet him.' Then all the virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. We have already shown that the tarrying time of the bridegroom by the prophetic periods was 6 months, beginning the 19th of April down to the 22nd of October." So he's here laying forth a line that is beginning on April 19, 1844, and it's ending when? On October 22nd, 1844. And what does he call this time period? He calls it a night. A night of tarrying. What the pioneers refer to as the tarrying time. It covered a period of 6 months spanning from April 19, 1844 to October 22nd, 1844. And it's identified as a night of tarrying because they were in darkness regarding their true position after the first disappointment, which happened on April 19, 1844. And they were tarrying, waiting for greater light or understanding on when the prophetic periods would come to a close, because they were evidently wrong with the first time that they had said. So it was a night of darkness while they were waiting for light from the Lord. And this light, which gave them clarity regarding their true position, was the midnight cry. But it goes on to say, the midnight of this dark, stupid time would be about July 20th. Samuel Snow gave the true midnight cry in the tabernacle in Boston at this time, and it was received by the virgins in a different light from what it ever was before. He says he had been trying to make people believe it before, but without effect, because it was generally believed, as we had been taught from 1840, that the midnight cry embraced the whole subject. even beginning back to the French Revolution, and some were old enough to believe it had begun in the day of the apostle. But now it began to move with rapid progress. God was giving the light by his Spirit. I well remember some that I conversed with who related the wonderful manner in which they were moved upon to examine the subject before they had heard it. So from here, he identifies that in this 6-month night of tarrying, the midpoint or midnight, the middle of the night, he says about July 20th. But if you want to be exact, it was on July 21st, 1844. And this is where Samuel Snow gave the message at the Boston Tabernacle. And we see here that it began to be received in a manner different from before. We see it beginning to have power on the minds of the people who heard it from this point on, right? So July 21st, Boston, this is also midnight or midway. From April 19 to October 22nd, midnight is the 21st of July. And he goes on to say, a camp meeting was held in Concord, New Hampshire, somewhere about the 1st of August. Here, as we afterward learned, the cry resounded through the camp. Right? So he identifies that the next development happened in Concord, New Hampshire, August 1st, 1844. And this was Concord. Where the same midnight cry message was given. And he says, on the 12th of August, another was held in Exeter, New Hampshire. On my way there, something like the following seemed to be continually forcing upon my mind. You are going to have new light here, something that will give a new impetus to the work. How many thousand living witnesses there still are scattered over the land that experience the manifestation of the Spirit's power in applying to their hearts the many scriptures, and especially the clear exposition of the parable of the 10 virgins at that meeting. There was light given and received there, sure enough, and when the meeting closed, the granite hills of New Hampshire rang with the mighty cry, behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him. So that's the end of the portion that we want to read. But he identifies that following Concord, he says that camp meeting began on August 12. We can mark the cry as going forth on August 14 and 15. We'll just say 15 for simplicity. And this was in Exeter. So here we have the midnight cry going forward with greatest power. Then October 22nd, 1844, this was the shut door. So what has been narrated by the pioneer is just an overview of the history of the midnight cry message in Millerite history. So what are we going to do? We're going to do two things. The first point, we're going to identify the specific components of Samuel Snow's midnight cry message, right? We're going to parallel this with ours to make a specific point, right? To compare this midnight cry with the history of our midnight cry, to notice a specific development. But before we do that, I want us to identify the actual components. When we say Samuel Snow's midnight cry message, what did it comprise of, right? what truths comprised his midnight cry message. Because it wasn't a single truth. It wasn't just, behold, the bridegroom cometh. Right? There were specific truths, prophetic truths, which together pointed to, which came together to make a specific conclusion, right? And those truths constitute his midnight cry message. Each of those truths contributed specific elements to the final conclusion that he arrived at. And what was that final conclusion? That the prophetic periods would close on October 22nd, 1844, and that it is at that point that he believed that Christ would come at the end of the prophetic periods. I saw some people taking pictures. This is yesterday's study. Anyone? We got it? Or whoever took pictures, if anyone doesn't have it, you can share with those who may still want it. So we ask ourselves, what were the components of Samuel Snow's midnight cry message? A study of the articles he wrote, a study of the document, the True Midnight Cry, will give you this, but we can lay them out in summary fashion. The first truth that we can identify is the 6,000 years. The second is the times of the Gentiles, the 2520. The third is the 70 weeks. The fourth, the 2300 days. And the fifth, the types from the feast days. I think these are the 5 key components of Samuel Snow's Midnight Cry. And each of these truths contributed, right? Contributed towards the final grand conclusion, which was that the prophetic periods end on October 22nd, 1844. When you look at each of these components, you can identify the contribution that they made towards that final conclusion, right? When you look at the 6,000 years, what did it give you? When you looked at the times of the Gentiles, what did that give him? The 70 weeks, what did that give him? The 2300 days, what did that give him? As well as the feasts. You can identify that, and it's useful to look at it and understand, these are the building blocks of that grand conclusion. Behold, the bridegroom cometh, go ye out to meet him, because the prophetic periods end on October 22nd, 1844. When we look at the 6,000 years, he identified that 1844 would mark the end of 6,000 years, right? Or the beginning of the 7th, was the 7th millennium? I'm going to get caught out now because I didn't go back and look at this in detail. Trying to work off my memory is not always reliable. But anyway, he identified that 1844 was the end of 6,000 years. The times of the Gentiles, that 1844 marked the end of the scattering. And that God would begin to gather, Christ would come to gather his people thereafter. Now, when you look at the 70 weeks, he He clarified the 70 weeks by identifying that 31 AD was the crucifixion, and that 34 AD was the end of the 490 years. Therefore, 1,810 years from 34 AD would take you to 1844. The 2300 days come to an end in 1844, right? And the types from the feasts, what did these give him? They gave him spring and fall, and what else? Right, the Day of Atonement was on the 10th day of the 7th month. So these gave him the 10th day of the 7th month, which in 1844 was October 22nd. So you look at Samuel Snow's Midnight Cry, the various components of the message, it was like pieces of a puzzle. They came together to bolster the final conclusion that he was presenting. So when you look at our Midnight Cry message, it's the same way. Now, this is a useful exercise, and I want to leave it with you because I think it's a bigger exercise than we can do justice in this hour. But to look at our Midnight Cry message, to identify its components, and to strive to understand all these various components such that you can identify its contribution towards the grand conclusion, towards the just as we've done here with Millerite history. But now when we come to our Midnight Cry, what are the components that comprise it? The very first thing presented, at least in October last year, was? No, it wasn't Acts 27. Fatima. Then, Acts 27.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
With these 5 that you have for the Midnight Cry, were those presented at those camp meetings, or were some of these done before those camp meetings?
You could trace that much of this Samuel Snow understood before Boston even. Right? He was preaching this before Boston, for the most part. Some of these clarifications, like the one on the 70 weeks, there was a letter that he wrote post-Boston, I think, where he put that in place for the first time.
So the reason I'm asking is because feasts are like the clarification of when, with the feast, spring and fall, and then further the Day of Atonement. So I was just wondering if the clarification on the King of the South is part of the Midnight Cry.
For us? I'll have to think about that.
Other question?
Yes?
31 AD for the 70 weeks. What have you said about that?
I said before the 70 weeks was, the relation of the 70 weeks to the 2300 days was not fully understood. He identified that 31 AD was the crucifixion. Before, if my memory serves me correctly, they put the crucifixion at 34 AD, right? So he's identifying 31 AD was the crucifixion, 34 AD was the end of the 490 years. So given that the 490 years is connected with the 2300 days, right? They have the same starting point. He calculated that, okay, so subtracting 490 from 2300, you have 1810 years left. So it's 1810 years that we have to add to 34 AD to come to the correct end of the 2300 days, which is 1844. Right, so we can identify the wars of the Diadochi. Specifically the Fourth War. The Pyrrhic Wars. Pyrrhus and his history, yes? The Wars of the Diadochi give us Ipsus, right? The Pyrrhic Wars gives us Heraclea, Asculum, and Beneventum. Then we have World War II. Sixth, we have this concept of information warfare and tracing the development of that within our line and using that to define what the fulfillment of the battles between the King of the North and the King of the South look like within our line. There's this concept of 2014 being midway. The applications of 10 years. The prophetic spans. Do you know what I mean when I say prophetic spans?
490.
Yes. Those lines of 490, 220, 215, 81, 40, all those numbers from which we identify a dynamic that we see at the beginning of them, and then we count we count to the end essentially of those various numbers, right? And they bring us to 2019. Hopefully we've seen that study, right? Where we have 2019, right? And then there are various timelines that are laid out. We say this is 490, 220, 81, 40, 25, all these being numbers of prophetic significance. And if you count backwards from 2019, the number of years, they take you to a date where you see a significant prophetic development, which carries through to the end, right? So I'm sure, hopefully we're familiar with that prophetic spans. That's what is being referred to there. And the November 9s. Because when we look at these prophetic spans, some of those dates, some of those years, we can identify the specific date as November 9, which carries us through to November 9, 2019, right? So when we look at our Midnight Cry message, I'm suggesting that these are the components of it, right? And the exercise that I want to challenge us to consider, we're not going to do it now, is just as we've done here with, in summary fashion, with Samuel Snow's Midnight Cry, you're identifying each element of the Midnight Cry message and its contribution towards what I'll call the grand conclusion, right? If we challenge ourselves to acquire a robust enough understanding of each of these concepts, each of these elements of our Midnight Cry message, that we can articulate their contribution, right, to the grand conclusion, right? And you can see off the top, it's a lot of work, but it can be done. We'll all be the better off for it if we challenge ourselves to do that. So we have the Millerite midnight cry, and we have our midnight cry. Just looking at the elements that are presented, you'll notice a difference, right? A difference in the character of the messages presented. This is divine hour, but I feel tempted to ask the question. As you look at these two, I'll ask the question, it's fine. What is the, I'll say this, I'll give direction, thematic difference between the Millerite midnight cry and our midnight cry? What thematic differences? You can see they're different, right? But how would you articulate that? Well, I hope we can see that they're different. How do we articulate that, the thematic differences between the two messages? Yes?
If nobody will go, I'll go.
Give it a shot.
The left side straight out of the Bible.
Straight out of the Bible?
They're seen really easy straight out of the Bible.
Okay, more directly identifiable, you know. But here, so what is this based on? How would you articulate that?
History.
History.
More current history. The last 100 years history.
Well, there's that compared to this, right? But we do see old history, the Diadochi Wars,
Okay.
Pyrrhic Wars, Acts 27, right? So there's that. But I get the difference that you're saying, which is, one is when you look at these messages, they're derived, I say, more directly. They're readily more identifiable from texts that you're presented with in the Bible. Whereas with some of the, and it's true, like Diadochi Wars, those are biblical.
But most people couldn't tell you what verse that
You have to dig. I would say with these here, a lot of it is based on structures, not just texts, right? Which we can, which Samuel Snow went to support, to bring out all these truths here. But here we're using texts and structures. And if you're going to rely solely on texts, you won't necessarily see all the things that we're talking about here. That's a difference. But when it comes to the themes, the thematic difference, let me lay it out this way. You can see it from the board, really. And once I say it, you will see it, that you can see it from what we laid out on the other side. But let's trace the development of the Midnight Cry in Millerite history, right? April 19, 1844, what happened? There was a disappointment. Who was disappointed? Millerite, God's people, right? And it also marked a rejection of the final rejection of the first angel by the people to whom the first angel had been sent. Who was the first angel sent to in the language of the seven churches? It was sent to God's people. It was sent to Sardis, right? The Protestant churches, right? So we have here April 19. This is a development in the world or in the church? So it's internal. When we look at July 21st, the Midnight Cry begins to be received in a different light in Boston. Is that development in the world or in the church? Or in the nation of the United States or in the church? In the church. So that's internal. August 1st, camp meeting Concord. Internal or external? Internal. August 15, Exeter. This is internal. And October 22nd, this is internal also. When we look at the Midnight Cry in Millerite history, it's dealing principally with internal developments. Know that this line is not exclusively internal. You have August 11, 1840, right? But when we look at the Midnight Cry specifically in Millerite history, it's principally internal. Now, when we look at our Midnight Cry, or when we look at our history as typified by the history of the Millerite Midnight Cry, does that make sense? When we look at our history as typified by this Millerite history that we've just laid out, what are we presented with? April 19 is 9/11, right? Midnight, July 21st, this is 2014. August 1st,
November 9, unless you're going to count. Oh, okay, yeah, you're not going that far forward.
this is Concord. 2016? Yeah. And Exeter, 2018. And here, October 22nd, this is November 9, 2019. We can trace events within our line. 9/11, for example. What do we see at 9/11? It's the beginning of the outpouring of the early rain. Yes? Is that internal or external? Internal. 2014 is the beginning of the latter rain. I'll suggest that this is internal also. In 2016, we see a significant development within the movement. Ordination. We'll unpack this further, but I'll say this is internal. 2018, the Midnight Cry message is proclaimed and definite time is brought into focus. And November 9, internally, it's the shut door for the priests. So all that has been laid out here. This is the internal, right? All this is internal. But what is a peculiarity of our history when compared to the Millerite history? What is a peculiarity of our history when compared to the Millerite history?
External events.
Right, that there is a there are external events that we can trace through parallel, that there's the external events that we can identify that parallel these internal ones. When we look at, and I'm sure you've seen this representation of threading a needle through, right? through the waymarks to bring us to our time and to develop a narrative based on the beginning and identifying the development of that object or symbol we're seeking to understand, identifying its development through to our time to understand what it looks like at the end in our time. When we look at the external at 9/11, what do we see? We see the passing of the Patriot Act. We see Islam. In 2014, what is the external development? Yes, this is more recent. What is the external development that we see in 2014? What are the external developments?
Freedom for America.
The Freedom Act? Okay, so you're looking at the further development from the Patriot Act. Okay, the Freedom Act, that was by Obama. And that was in 2014.
I think it might have been a little after. I think it was 14.
I think it was 2014 too. But that's not on my list.
Okay.
Right. But okay, so the Freedom Act, 2014, right? What else happened externally? That's when we have collusion, right?
Just started, yeah.
Collusion between Trump and Putin. We have Russia attacking Ukraine in the language of the line of Pyrrhus. This is Tarentum attacking Thuri, right? Russia attacks Ukraine and takes Crimea. So there's the beginning of that conflict. What else do we see? We see an Islamic caliphate. A development of the third woe. When you come to 2016, externally, we have the election of Trump. Right? And the election of Trump, this is in the language of the Pyrrhic Wars, or rather in the language of the Wars of the Diadochi, this is what? Ipsis. In 2018, this is the Battle of Heraclea. And what do we mark externally in 2018? Heraclea was fulfilled towards the end of last year, and it was won by Putin. How do we see? We see it involved spheres of influence, right? Putin, or rather Trump, agreeing to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan, gave ground to Russia, right, in the area of spheres of influence. Economically, Trump also gave ground to Russia by removing sanctions that were on some of Putin's top men, the oligarchs who are responsible for keeping his finances, essentially. Oleg Deripaska in particular. So you see, I'll just put here spheres of influence. And that's the Battle of Heraclea is won by the king of the south. It was won by Pyrrhus, it's won by Putin, and this was in 2018. There's a good presentation on this, a standard, on this particular thing. I'd encourage us to watch it if we haven't already. And then on November 9th, we have the fulfillment of the Battle of Raphia. So when we look at Millerite history, we see that the Midnight Cry then, the history of it is internal, principally. The history of it is internal. When we look at our line, we have internal, but we also have a very distinct external line. And we find ourselves confronted with rather strange, or at least they feel strange, maybe initially, problems or challenges, right? There's that big book over there, the Mueller report, right? Why is that important? Why are we suddenly being challenged with, what's happening in the political system of the United States, right? And whether there was a fraudulent activity that took place, right? Why does that suddenly become important to us? When we look at, specific developments on the world stage, right? The war in Syria, the war in Afghanistan, whether America withdraws or not, the relationship of Russia and America within that conflict, right? How does that suddenly become important? The American Constitution, suddenly we're confronted with that. We start to realize that we're being called to come to a really clear understanding of the nature and purpose of that document, right? Why are we suddenly confronted with all of this political information, right? And we see these developments, they are part of the Midnight Cry message, right? We're required to know these things as they are part of the message that is our Midnight Cry. So we see it's fundamentally different in character from the Millerite Midnight Cry, and that the Millerite Midnight Cry was very, I'll say scriptural, very, it's dealing with scriptural themes. Maybe that's a poor way to frame it, but do you get my point? It's dealing with biblical themes, right? And ours is very political, right? And a lot of people, or at least some people I've interacted with, have been challenged by that, right? To say why is this important? Why do we suddenly need to be following the news? Why does it matter? Well, firstly, I never used to watch news that much in the first place, right? And why does it even matter whether I'm watching mainstream media or the right-wing populist press? Why does it suddenly matter whether you're watching Fox News versus CNN, BBC, whether you read the Washington Post or so on? Why does that suddenly matter, right? And you're being confronted with all these things. And we're saying that they're part and parcel of our message. We see that. We see that when we parallel the two messages. The history of the Millerite Midnight Cry is internal. Ours, we have internal and external. Having laid that out, we see, when we compare the two messages, we see that that is a difference. What I want is to explain it. Why? Why is it like that? Right? And I think there's some simple explanations for that. The first answer I'll draw from, I'll take from Daniel 8, right? The message that tested the Millerites, the message unsealed to William Miller, what was it? Daniel 8:14. Now you go to Daniel 8. When you look at Daniel 8, what is the theme of Daniel 8? You see a ram, right? But it's deformed, right? What was wrong with this ram?
One horn bigger than the other.
One horn was bigger than the other, right? And this ram is subsequently challenged by a he-goat that was also deformed, right? It had a big horn between its eyes, right? And subsequent to that, you see the growth of a little horn, And then the chapter progresses to the identification of the cleansing of the sanctuary. When you look throughout Daniel chapter 8, there is a theme that you see woven throughout the chapter. And what is that theme? It's the sanctuary, right? It's the, when you look at a ram is a sanctuary animal, right? It was sacrificed in the sanctuary. When you look at a goat is a sanctuary animal. But you have this ram, this goat, they're deformed, right? Showing that these kingdoms are represented as impure beasts. But it's the religious element, the sanctuary, and the sanctuary that are being emphasized in Daniel chapter 8. Now, what I want us to see, or what I want to suggest, is that Daniel chapter 8, the Millerites' first angel's message, it had a religious theme, and this religious theme had an impact on how their midnight cry was formulated and understood, right? How it was formulated and taught. When we come to our line, what is our message? The message unsealed to the reformer. It was Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And what's Daniel 11 principally dealing with?
It's a story about how the
Kings.
of the earth, which has more so to do with political.
Exactly. King of the north and king of the south, right? And the conflict between these two leading right to the close of probation. These are kingdoms, right? It's dealing with kings, and kings are chiefly political, right? So now as we come to our midnight cry, right, what should we expect to see? That, because our midnight cry should deal chiefly with, or at least we can expect it to be political in character, based on the theme of the chapter on which it is based. Does that make sense? So a political theme characterizes the entire chapter of Daniel 11. When both chapters are compared and contrasted, this observation is more pronounced, right? So that's the first witness. How much time do I have left?
30 minutes.
Oh, sorry.
Are you going to
5? 3?
No, that's a no.
Wow.
I thought that was the second one.
It's
Or in my mind, I made a distinction between internal and external, and then one is more scriptural and the other scriptural based, or more readily identifiable as being scriptural, while the other one is more readily identifiable as being political. So I separated in my head, but if it's one, and that's okay as well. Or
Okay.
I guess you can say those external events that pertain to our line are exemplified or shown by the political going back and forth. I don't know, I just separated it in my head.
okay. Well, the way I'd formulated it in my mind to approach it was, you lay out the Millerite midnight cry, then you lay out our history, and then you pinpoint that here we see it's chiefly internal. Here we see internal, but we see a significant external component that you can weave all the way through. So to point out the difference, right? So I don't think this was a witness in and of itself, at least in my mind. And then to begin to put down witnesses to explain, right, the difference. So the first witness, I'm saying, that explains why our midnight cries, why it is challenging us in new ways, right? You see the reason for it when you look at the theme of the chapter from which it is drawn in God's word, right? Daniel chapter 8 versus Daniel chapter 11. That's one line of thought. The second that I will share with us. When we look at Millerite history, this is an old thought that we've had. When you look at the lamb-like beast, right, it's a lamb-like beast, and this lamb-like beast has horns. What are those two horns? Republicanism and Protestantism. And before the lamb-like beast can speak as a dragon, which is past religious legislation that persecutes, there must be a change, right? Or a removal, symbolically, of those two horns, right? And we trace the removal of the two horns, beginning in Millerite history, right through to our time. And it began with the Protestant horn. When do we say the Protestant horn was removed? April 19. This is when the Protestant horn is removed. Because the Protestant churches, by rejecting the first angel's message, the second angel's message came declaring them that they are Babylon and they've fallen. And they're going to fall progressively from this time forward up until our history, where we see the passing of the Sunday law. So the Protestant horn fell in Millerite history. The Republican horn falls in our history. When does the Republican horn fall? We've taught at 9/11, but in relation to the midnight cry, where have we located it? Not at the Sunday law. It's done by the Sunday law. Any thoughts?
November 9th.
No. Before November 9th. Not 24. By process of elimination. Right. So 2016.
The start of it.
Yes, basically say progressively, right?
Okay. Because of the election.
Yeah, so here we have the Protestant horn. You're going to come to the right answer eventually that way. I'll explain. I'm saying this is the Republican horn. When you look at the wars of the Diadochi, you have the Battle of Ipsus. 2016 parallels is typified by the Battle of Ipsus. And what do you see at the Battle of Ipsus? You see Antigonus and his son Demetrius in conflict with an alliance. Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. And Ptolemy, of course, was otherwise engaged. So, and in that war, the most powerful, Antigonus was the most powerful of Alexander's successors, right? And we identify him as the, how should I phrase it? The one who was like Alexander, right? In terms of fulfilling the role that Alexander did in conquering and unifying the then known world. Of course, he didn't run all of it, but we see him carrying forward the work of Alexander. And he was a powerful general after the mold of Alexander, right? So, what does his name even mean, Antigonus?
Something to do with Alexander, I can't remember.
Antigonus. It means like the ancestors, right? Or like the ancestor, right? When you look at Antigonus, right? So who is the ancestor within the context of that history? The beginning of their kingdom, it would necessarily be Alexander, right? So he is the one who is like Alexander. He is like the ancestors. He's like the one who was at the beginning of their history. And in this war, he's defeated, he is killed, right? Now, when we look at the fulfillment of that in our time, one application of the Battle of Ipsus, because there are a number of ways of looking at it, but we've taught that the US election in 2016, you see a conflict where between Antigonus and Antigonus represented by Trump and no, sorry, other way around. Antigonus represented by Clinton, right? And who represents Trump?
Iris or Dimitri.
Let me jog my memory because there are two applications. Let me see. What? I'll say this. That's your homework. But okay, but we do have this battle where we see Antigonus is represented by Clinton. In that election, Clinton is the one who is like the ancestor. He is the one who and when you look at America's ancestors, who were they? They're constitutionalists, the people who framed the Constitution, those who were at the beginning. And when we look at the politics of Clinton and even Obama before her, they were constitutionalists, right? They understood the import of the Constitution and they upheld it, right? As far as the to preserve, and as far as the purpose that it was framed to fulfill. But now we see her being defeated in that election, and Trump being placed in, and this development, Ipsus, the death of and last hope for constitutionalism in the United States, right? She's the last hope for constitutionalism in the United States, and in 2016, she is killed, symbolically speaking, right? So we can symbolically place the death or removal of the Republican horn here in 2016, right? The last hope for constitutionalism has died, and it's just downward from there. A downward march towards tyranny, right? And the unification of church and state and all the other things that we teach that Trump and the apostate Protestants and the Republican Party are going to accomplish. Okay, so when we look at the message given in each of these respective reformatory lines, what do we see? We see that the message is adapted to warn against the fall of the specific horn that was being addressed in that time. Did you catch it? When you look at these two reform lines, we see that the message is adapted, the character of the message is adapted to warn God's people against the fall of the horn that fell in the given time period. Right? When you're dealing with the Protestant horn, that's churchcraft, right? So the message, the midnight cry message as well, or in this history, you should see a message that is principally characterized by churchcraft. So I'm saying that here, our history is dealing with the fall of the Republican horn, which is statecraft, which is the political aspect. So from that perspective, it should not be a surprise to see that much of our message is dealing with that, right, in terms of the information that is being presented in relation to it, right? Because in our history, it's the Republican horn that's going down. I won't put in any more thoughts, right? So we're comparing and contrasting the Millerite Midnight Cry message, our Midnight Cry message, and we see that they're different in character. And we've explained these differences, and we've laid down two witnesses, right, that seek to explain why our Midnight Cry is framed the way that it is. Because some people, even me initially, right, not that it bothered me, but it's something that I noticed, that, we're really being drawn into a very close consideration of political things in a way that I've always watched news personally, but a lot of people don't. And I've seen that, the direction the message is taking, it's calling people to consider political developments much more closely in a way that we really haven't seen before. And for some people, that just doesn't come to them naturally. It's just not a subject of natural interest. It's a challenge, right? And the natural question is why. But when we look at the two witnesses that we've laid out based on the character of the messages and the structure of our line is illustrating the fall of two horns, the nature of the message as it is being presented to us, I think, is explained. I will close there. I hope that was helpful. Let's close the word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word and the ground we've been able to cover this morning. Lord, we ask that your Spirit may set your seal of approval upon the things that have been shared, and may they be brought to our minds and may be sealed in our memories. May they inform our understanding and give us that much more confidence in your leading. And Lord, that much more impetus to challenge ourselves to take hold of this information, to make it our own, to seek to become knowledgeable, Lord, to explain the developments happening in the world from a biblical perspective, Lord, but also to understand their import, to be able to explain the significance of these political developments in relation to what we teach is going to happen. Please bless us now as we break, and may you keep us over the rest of the Sabbath, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.